Be careful who you open your door to on Halloween. This incident happened to me last year on Halloween. My little brother and I were home alone since our parents had gone out to a Halloween party. They had tasked us with handing out candy to the trick-or-treaters. This bummed my brother and I out because we had made plans to go out trick-or-treating with a few friends. Our parents told us that we were too old to still be trick-or-treating, and that we could instead invite our friends over to the house and hang out there. My friends declined my invitation to come over because they still wanted to go trick-or-treating, so that left me home alone with my brother handing out candy. A lot of people stopped by our house, and by 10 p.m. almost all the candy was gone. My brother and I decided that we'd eat the rest. We were sitting on the couch, watching a scary movie, stuffing ourselves with candy, when there was a knock at the door. I stormed off the couch, wondering who the hell could be knocking on our door this late. I assumed that it was just some late-night trick-or-treaters. Even if that was the case, I had turned the porch light and Halloween decorations off, which should have been a dead giveaway that we were out of candy or that we weren't home. I figured it was our parents. Being cautious, I looked through the peephole and saw a suspicious man standing on our front porch. He was wearing a black hoodie with the hood over his head, which made it difficult to see his face. The only detail of his face I could spot was that he had a beard and dry, crusty lips. There was no way that this guy was a trick-or-treater because he wasn't wearing a costume and was far too old to be trick-or-treating alone. His hands were stuffed in the front pocket of his hoodie, and he also looked very thin. Every single red flag went off in my head about this guy. There was no way in hell I was going to open the door. Still looking through the peephole, I watched as he knocked on the door again. He seemed desperate for us to open the door, and he was shaking a bit. It wasn't cold outside. At least, definitely not cold enough for someone to be trembling. He was giving me a bad vibe, and I wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. "We're out of candy," I shouted to him. I watched as a smile spread across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile either. "Are you alone in there?" the man asked, almost in a mocking voice. His voice was raspy and dry. "Should I call the police?" my little brother asked me quietly, gripping his cell phone. The man let out a low grumble and said, "Sounds like you're not alone in there." I continued to watch him through the peephole. His hands were still wedged tightly in his pocket, and he was still shaking vigorously. I began to wonder if he was armed. I decided to take action and spoke to him in the most intimidating voice I could. "Get the fuck away from my house or I'll call the police," I shouted. His smile faded and he bared his teeth. His teeth were piss yellow, and I concluded that he was probably on drugs. He had a look of fury plastered on his face. Fortunately, he left without trying to break in, probably because he knew I wasn't fucking around with him. I didn't stop watching him through the peephole until I saw him completely leave our property. My brother and I let out a sigh of relief and decided not to call the police. We were still a bit paranoid after this and watched TV until our parents came home. We didn't tell them about the man since he hadn't really done anything to harm us. Now when I think back to this, I wish we had called the police because maybe we would have been able to prevent a murder. You see, the next day we found out that the elderly woman who lived a few houses down from us had been brutally murdered. Her neighbor had found her lying on her front porch, covered in blood. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. My brother and I immediately knew who had done it, and we told the police what we knew. They couldn't do much from the information we had given them since we hadn't seen many details of his face. They went on the hunt for the man but never caught him. I blame myself for that poor old lady's murder because I could have prevented it from happening just by calling the police. I think the most disturbing thing of all is the fact that he didn't take anything from the old lady's house. Her house had been left untouched, but he could have gone in and taken what he wanted since her door was wide open. This means that he just wanted to kill. That was his only intention. He didn't want money or jewelry. He only had the urge to murder. awoke to my mother screaming. Since it's around that time, I figured it's the perfect opportunity to share my story. There is a mention of domestic violence. It's the early 90s. I was 6 years old at the time, living with my parents and brothers in a duplex. The events of the night are still burned into my memory all these years later. Friday night, my father hadn't come home from drinking, so me and my mom camped out on the couch, watching a horror movie marathon. I should add that my father would get pretty drunk and was super abusive, so my mom slept with a knife next to her on nights he would stay out late. It was a rough time for us, but we got through it the best we could. We were watching Halloween, eating snacks, laughing, having an enjoyable time. We fell asleep around 10 p.m. on the couch, Mom with her back to the couch and cuddling me. The next thing I know, I wake up to my mom screaming. This wasn't unusual in my house as, again, my dad was an abusive drunk. But when I opened my eyes, a tall, thin man in a black hoodie was standing over us. Not my dad. My eyes met his, and his met mine. My mom was fast to react. She grabbed the knife from the coffee table and lunged at him. He stumbled backwards and regained his footing before he ran out the sliding glass door. My mom jumped up, slammed the door shut, and locked it. She called the police. When the police got there, they said he probably used a knife to pop the lock. They'd noticed a ton of cigarette butts that didn't match my parents outside the sliding glass door. The police said he was probably sitting out there watching us all night before getting the courage to come in. The police said they had several calls of a peeping Tom that matched his description in our complex over the past couple months. For whatever reason, he chose our house to be his first. My parents got divorced shortly after, and we moved in with my grandma, so thankfully no more encounters. But still, to this day, looking out a window at night still makes me uneasy that someone's on the other side, watching. I'm pretty sure I almost became a murdered babysitter urban legend. I told this story to many in my inner circle around the time it happened, but I figured I would talk about it once more since it seems to fit the theme. 2 years ago, right around Halloween, I was babysitting for these two ladies who each had a son. They wanted to go out, so I stayed at one of their houses and watched their boys. It was around 8 p.m., and the boys were sitting on the couch, playing on their iPads and whatnot, when somebody knocked on the door. I asked them if anyone was supposed to come over, and they both said no. I go over and check the eye hole in the door, and it's some guy in a gray hoodie, deliberately hunched over so I can't see his face. Immediately I'm like, what the hell? I'm immediately weirded out and don't say anything and start pacing around because I don't want to give him any inclination we're inside. A couple minutes later, I check outside the window through the curtains, and he's gone. I didn't want to spook the kids anymore, and there weren't any more knocks, so I just kind of let it go as a prank. Cut to a few hours later, and the moms get back. They ask me how everything was, and I say the kids were great, but somebody had come to the door. They ask me what time, and I say around 8, and one of the moms start freaking out and going through her phone. The other one tells me that right around that time, somebody had been making strange phone calls to them on a blocked number. They had disguised their voice and were saying things like, "I can see you through your window." And they didn't think it was serious because it didn't make sense in the context of where they were. But in retrospect, we were almost positive it was me he was looking at through the window. They escorted me to my car. I touched base later, and apparently nothing strange ever happened after that. But I'm just really glad I didn't open that door. I have a feeling in my gut it would have been horrific.